My lords, follow that. I want to say very clearly to start with, first of all, thank Lord Avery for introducing this debate, that, as a number of people have said, the Church of England is on record supporting the principle of the abolition of what you've helpfully called CRL, so that we can speak in a shorthand. It's very important to stress that. We're on record for saying that we support the abolition in principle. The question is how and on what terms. Clearly it's in nobody's interest to hear stories like the one we just heard from Lord Roker, but how could it be abolished? And the fact is that property, not just the properties under CRL, is often subject to rights and restrictions. It's not new and it's not unusual. On the Wallbank case in 2003, the House of Lords recognised that this was a right commensurate with other rights. Lord Rogers, in the 2003 judgment, said, and I quote, "In principle, I do not find it possible to distinguish CRL from the liability which would attach to the owner of a land which is purchased subject to a mortgage, restrictive covenant, or other encumbrance created by a predecessor in title." So the fact is that it may feel anachronistic, but it's not unusual for properties to be subject to these kind of restrictions and challenges. And in law, the most recent judgment we have from the House of Lords, Lord Rogers, is that it's not easy to distinguish it from others. We can distinguish the pastoral effects of the cases, but in terms of good practice of the management of property and of rights, it's a much more complicated issue. Second point, Lord Avery made important statements about the amount of funding the Church of England receives from the government, and that's very welcome. But as Baroness Wilcox said, the churches have to put in an enormous effort to maintain not just this vital part of our built environment, but a facility that's there for people when they want it, as they want it, on their terms, and a very few of us keep these buildings fit for purpose as a spiritual resource and a spiritual sign. It's interesting the 1936 Tithes Act did not abolish CRL. Parishes are often willing to come to a sensible arrangement, and we've heard it was a very tortuous route in the story we've just heard. But for instance, in my own diocese in Derby, one of the former Dukes of Devonshire had quite a lot of liability in the number of parishes of which he was a patron, and years ago he commuted this responsibility in return for a financial payment, now has no liability at all. And I make that point because, of course, if we suddenly abolish all this, some people in good faith have paid compensation to recognise the right and that the church needs to be recompensed in some way. And we've heard again that trustees have a liability on themselves to maximise assets. You can't just, again, I don't endorse the way it's been done in the story Lord Roker gave us, and that was the wrong enthusiasm, but you have to be enthusiastic for maximising the assets that you oversee. So how can we proceed to get rid of this CRL and all the problems it causes? Well, the advice we receive is that under the European Convention of Human Rights, under the Human Rights Act, the previous practice of the government with the Tithes Act, and the previous practice of individuals like the Devonshires, is that in all those cases, such a right is commuted in return for some kind of compensation. And that's the principle, I think, in which legislation would need to proceed. It's a well-known constitutional principle that Parliament does not deprive a subject of a right in the nature of property without providing compensation. That's a well-known bit of our constitutional practice. So I would propose that we have to proceed to change. All the speeches have made that clear. It has to be done on the basis of compensation. I think compensation would be fair to the current liabilities that property owners hold, because they are legal liabilities. It would be fair to give parishes notice and some kind of recompense having to take on even greater burden for the maintenance of the building. And it would be fair to current legislation and good practice in the administration of property and the administration of property law, as Lord Rogers reaffirmed in 2003. So we're fully behind this, it's just how it's done, and I think there's a very strong case there needs to be some element of compensation to be fair to all concerned.